Everyone, welcome back to another Bible study. This week we're looking at Psalm 32. So let's jump on into it. So Psalm 32 is a Davidic psalm. If you haven't joined us in the past, a Davidic psalm means the psalm begins with the phrase Le David, the Hebrew phrase, right? Because these poems were written in Hebrew originally. So it begins with the phrase Le David, meaning to David, of David, by David, for David. So we don't know whether David wrote it or it was written for David by someone else or something related to David. Is really all we can gather from that. Now, with this psalm, it's all about sin. So if it is by David, we could place it in a time in his life, probably after he had committed adultery with Bathsheba, after a big sin in his life and how it had weighed on him. That's kind of what this psalm is all about. So we don't know exactly when it was written or even who wrote it necessarily. But I like to keep that lens in the back of my mind as I'm reading the psalm and trying to interpret it and understanding that something like that could be what David was writing this psalm about, just to help me understand where the psalmist is coming from a little bit more with this psalm. Now, the genre of this psalm is a little bit confusing, right? We always look at the genre of the psalms that we're studying. So we've looked at it a lot of different genres: praise psalms, lament psalms, different kinds of psalms, right? But this one doesn't have one genre, really. It's kind of somewhere in the middle of two, somewhere in between a lament psalm and a thanksgiving psalm. Now, there's different kinds of lament psalms. There can be individual lament psalms or community lament psalms. So psalms written by one person for the sake of that one person or for the sake of one person, or community lament psalms written for or by a whole community. So where the individual lament psalm was saying, God, I need help, because remember, lament psalms are cries for help. God, I need help. The community could be the nation of Israel, for example, saying, God, we, your people, the nation of Israel, need your help. Now, specifically, this is a penitential lament psalm. So there's even more kinds of lament psalms. There's imprecatory lament psalms, and there's penitential lament psalms. So a penitential lament psalm is all about sin and kind of the cost of sin, or how you pay for that sin. That's what penance means, where this word comes from. It's also where the word penitentiary, same root, comes from. A prison, right, or a jail, somewhere where you pay for your crimes, you pay for your sins. That's what this kind of psalm is all about. So it's kind of a part lament psalm, but it's also part thanksgiving psalm. And I think it's a little bit closer to thanksgiving psalm than a lament psalm, but certainly both elements are present in this psalm. So a quick refresher on a lament psalm, we've already looked at them, but they have four parts. They're a cry for help, right? But they got four distinct parts in them for the most part. Part one is the complaint. They are sharing what the main problem is. Here's what is wrong with my life. Here's what is wrong with the world. Here's the problem that's happening. And part two is the cry for help. God, help me solve this problem. Part three, the expression of trust. God, here's the problem I gave you. I need your help solving it, but I trust that you are going to solve it. I trust that you've come through in the past for my ancestors and for me. Trust that you'll come through on this one as well. And then when you do part four here, I will praise you, the promise to praise. Now, a thanksgiving psalm can kind of be interpreted as part two of a lament psalm. Now, it's not based off one specific lament psalm. It's not like Psalm 32 is the Thanksgiving psalm correlated with Psalms 31, which is a lament psalm. I don't, off the top of my head, know what Psalm 31 is. But if you are thanking God for something that he solved, a problem he solved, somewhere where he came through in your life, theoretically, you could have wrote a lament psalm during that problem, and then the Thanksgiving psalm would be you thanking God for it. So let's go back here. Where lament psalm starts with a complaint, a problem, right? The Thanksgiving Psalms reports on that prior crisis. Here's what the problem was. Here's what was going on. And where a lament psalm then moves into a cry for help, the Thanksgiving Psalm describes the help received. God, I need help with this. Thanksgiving Psalm, God, thanks for coming through. Thanks for helping me with this problem I have. And then there's the expression of trust in the lament psalm. Doesn't really show up in the Thanksgiving Psalm too much. But then there's the promise to praise that ends it, right? Well, here in Thanksgiving Psalm, they end with a promise to praise. So let's dive into the psalm itself here. So verses 1 and 2. Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against them, and in whose spirit is no deceit. So right away, I want us to, a little refresher again, take a look at the synonymous parallelism in these verses, right? The lines the phrases that are parallel to one another, that relate to one another. And in these verses specifically, it's synonymous parallelism. They mean the same thing. So right away, blessed is the one, couldn't be more clear. They're literally word for word. But whose transgressions are forgiven is parallel with whose sins are covered. And both of these are also parallel with whose sin the Lord does not count against them. And somewhat parallel even to in whose spirit is no deceit. So right away we got a very parallel verse to start off the psalm. This is something that would catch the ear of a Hebrew listener. It would sound good to them, like a rhyme sounds good to an English in English poetry. This would sound good to a Hebrew reader, and they'd get them engaged in listening to this psalm. Now these verses set up the rest of the psalm, and the way they do it is a little bit unusual. So this is not a complaint. This is not a reporting on a crisis at all. Instead, this is the main idea of the psalm. Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven. We're getting the climax, the topic sentence, the thesis, whatever you want to call it, right at the start, right? Remember in the past we talked about how Hebrew poetry is often chiastic in nature, right? It makes the X, the Greek letter chi, the X, in that the big idea comes right in the middle. The main idea comes right in the middle. Here we're getting in the beginning. It shows up again in the middle, and then it shows up again at the end. So there's some chiastic elements to it, but it's unusual for them, for Hebrew poets, to start with all this. But in fact, this might actually help the English listener, us, to interpret it a little bit easier. So what's the psalm about? It's about sin and forgiveness. Move on to verses 3 and 4, and it becomes a little more regular here. When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy on me, and my strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. Psalmist here looking back on the complaint, right? They're reporting on the crisis, how their bones are wasting away, how they were groaning all night long, how God's hand was heavy on them. All of these things. And specifically, we find out more in verse 5 that it is about sin. It is about how their sin had weighed on them. The punishment they deserved for their sin, the guilt they felt, was weighing on them. Verse 5 then. Then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. So right here, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. That's kind of the other element of the climax of the psalm, I would say. This is, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. This is the big idea here. But here, this is the lament in that it's the psalmist asked for help, but it's more a thanksgiving psalm because it's really reporting on God delivering that help and delivering that forgiveness. Then it takes another weird turn here in verses 6 and 7. Therefore, let all the faithful pray to you while you may be found. Surely the rising of the mighty waters will not reach them. You are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble and surround me with songs of deliverance, songs of freedom from breaking the chains and the bonds that sin had on the psalmist's life. And it's teaching here the other people, to faithfully turn in prayer to God. Let all the faithful pray to you while you may be found. Verses 8 and 9 is where the psalm gets really weird, to be honest. I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my loving eye on you. Do not be like the horse and the mule, which have no understanding, but must be controlled by bit and bridle, or they will not come to you. So here there's a kind of a debate amongst biblical scholars about who is speaking. Is this David still speaking, or whoever wrote the psalm? Or is this God who is saying, I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go? It's a little weird, right? Yeah, David could be. And David was a pretty wise guy most of the time, but that seems odd. I would argue God is speaking here. But either way, whoever is doing the teaching here does not matter as much as what the teaching is saying. And the teaching is good. And what he's teaching is we ought to follow the way that God is leading us. And if we do, we will be controlled and we won't have to be forced to follow it. Like the horse and the mule who must be controlled by the bit and bridle. Don't be uncontrolled, but rather follow God's teachings. 3 more verses here. We're looking at 2 of them, verses 10 and 11. Many are the woes of the wicked, but the Lord's unfailing love surrounds the one who trusts in him. Rejoice in the Lord and be glad, you righteous. Sing, all you who are upright in heart. No, these are the last 2 verses, actually. Verse 10 shows trust in God, right? Many are the woes of the wicked, but the Lord's unfailing love surrounds the one who trusts in him. When we trust God, we are forgiven. So even though we might have woes because of our injustices, because of our wickedness, because of the sins we've committed, we are forgiven. Rejoice in the Lord and be glad, you righteous. Sing, all you who are upright in heart. And here the psalmist is praising God and invites all who have been forgiven to do so as well. When we read all you who are upright in heart, we might think, oh no, I sin. I'm not righteous. I'm not upright in heart. But in fact, because we have faith in Jesus and the resurrection, we are forgiven. And therefore, we are upright in heart. So we too get to join David in singing to God. Thanks for joining us for this Bible study. Hope you subscribe to the channel to see all our latest Bible studies. Like the video, helps us out. And there's a reflection guide in the description below if you want to dive deeper into the psalm and do a little more reflection on it as well. Thanks for joining us once again. I will see you next week. Bye, everyone.